Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into a question that is, well, it's fundamental to human development. It's universally asked.
And yet it has no simple answer.
Exactly. It just utterly defies a clean answer. So we're wrestling with this. What is the right age to begin having sex?
It really is the ultimate developmental crossroads. And, if you came here hoping for a specific number, 16, 18, 21, you're going to realize very quickly that readiness it's just far more complex.
Right.
The sources we looked at describe true sexual readiness not as some clear-cut legal deadline, but as a personal mosaic.
A personal mosaic. I like that. It's a very specific blend of legal compliance, physical development.
And crucially, emotional and psychological maturity.
That analogy is perfect. So our mission today is to analyze this idea of sexual timing across the entire human lifespan. We're not just isolating adolescence.
No, we're tracking it all the way from the legal baseline through biological peaks and then right into the often ignored experiences of older adults.
And to do that, we'll be using 3 distinct lenses on the material.
Exactly. First, the concrete but very varied global legal frameworks, so the age of consent. Second, the psychological outcomes and readiness tied to adolescent sexual debut.
And third,
the vital but, frequently taboo topic of sexuality in later life and all the health implications that come with it.
This deep dive required a serious stack of sources, everything from detailed legal tables, longitudinal research on risks and rewards, all the way to medical data on seniors. So let's jump in by establishing the most defined boundary we have.
The law.
The age of consent.
The age of consent. It's the official legal line in the sand. It's the age at which an individual is legally competent to consent to sexual activity.
Right. And crucially, anyone below this age is legally the victim and their partner is the offender, unless, of course, specific legal exceptions for age difference apply.
And this is where it immediately gets complicated. Oh, absolutely. That single number you see, 16, 18, 14, it's often just the starting point. When you really dig into international law, the sources show that consent rules fall into 3 main categories, and they are definitely not uniform across or even within countries.
Okay, so walk us through those 3 legal flavors of consent. What makes them so distinct?
So the first definition is consent that is restricted by age difference.
Right.
This rule basically acknowledges that, big age gaps can imply an imbalance of power. It means a younger person can legally consent, but only if the age difference isn't too big.
Something like 2 to 4 years.
Exactly. The sources noted a place like Belgium, where consent might be 14, but only if the older person is not more than 2 years older.
So a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old is fine, but a 14-year-old and a 25-year-old is not. It's a protection mechanism built right into the number.
Precisely. The second type is consent restricted by authority. In this case, the age of consent might be met, but that consent is voided if the older partner holds some kind of legally recognized position of trust or authority that they're abusing.
So like a teacher, a coach, a guardian.
Exactly. It's designed specifically to prevent that kind of exploitation. You could be in a state where the age is 18, but a 22-year-old professor with an 18-year-old student might still face specific charges.
That makes a lot of sense. Power dynamics can trump a birthday. And finally, the one we hear about most often.
That's the third one. Unrestricted consent. This is the age from which a person is legally deemed capable of consenting to sex with any other legally consenting adult.
And when we look at that unrestricted number, the global variation is, it's frankly jarring. We see it set at 14 in countries like China, Brazil, and Colombia.
Then you see it move up to 16 in places like Switzerland, South Korea, Russia, South Africa, and Ghana.
And then all the way up to 18.
Right, 18 is the unrestricted age in major countries like India, Turkey, the Philippines, Argentina, and Egypt. That's a 4-year swing between huge populations. It just reflects these vastly different cultural norms about when independence really begins.
And even that map isn't totally consistent. You pointed out the sources had tables for the US and Australia where it varies by state or territory.
Correct. In the US, unrestricted consent ranges from 16 all the way up to 21 in different states. It means the legal answer depends entirely on your exact geography. What's legal in one state might be a felony 100 miles away.
Wow.
And we also have to acknowledge jurisdictions like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan, where unrestricted consent is often tied directly to the marriageable age, or it might have rules specific to gender. The legal landscape is anything but simple.
So the law really only provides the floor, not the ceiling of readiness.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, let's leave the law behind and move into the realm of the physical. If the legal age is about competence, when does the body actually become physically ready?
Well, The body is ready remarkably early. Biology sets the clock with puberty. For girls, that typically starts between 8 and 13.
With menarche, the first period usually arriving around age 12 or 13.
Exactly. And for boys, puberty starts between 9 and 14, with spermarch, the first ejaculation around 13. So in short, the reproductive system is often fully capable in the early to mid-teens.
But this is where it gets really interesting, because capability is not the same thing as judgment.
That is the critical developmental disconnect, and it's really central to this whole deep dive. While the reproductive systems are online, the sources continually stress that the prefrontal cortex,
That's the part of the brain responsible for judgment, impulse control.
risk assessment, long-term consequences, all of it. That part of the brain is not fully wired and mature until the mid-20s.
So we have teenage bodies with adult hormones, but they're navigating the world with a brain that's still under construction.
That's it.
This biological gap must play into that old concept of the sexual peak. If the body's ready early, does the drive also peak early?
That's what some early, really influential research, like the Kinsey report, suggested. Kinsey argued that men peak in their late teens, measured mostly by frequency of orgasm, while women peak much later, often in their 30s.
But that's where the methodology of that early research gets a little shaky, right?
It does. Kinsey's data showed men reporting a high number of orgasms, often, through solitary means in adolescence.
Whereas the female peak in the 30s was chalked up to things like more experience, better communication with partners, or just increased self-knowledge.
And what's fascinating is how the hormonal timeline partially supports that early male peak, but the psychological timeline supports the later female peak. We know reproductive hormone levels peak in early adulthood. For cisgender men, testosterone starts its gradual decline as early as their early 20s.
So if we step away from those historical measures and look at what modern research says about when the drive and activity actually peak today.
Well, modern studies show cisgender men typically maintain a pretty vigorous sex drive through their early 20s. But cisgender women, on the other hand, they generally see a peak in interest and fantasies later, somewhere between 27 and 45.
So for many women, desire is far more correlated with experience and confidence than just raw hormones.
Precisely.
And if we look at peak activity, how often people are actually having sex, where does that fall?
Researchers find the highest rates of sexual activity are reported by men between 25 and 39, and for women, a bit earlier, between 20 and 29.
Okay, so there are all these different peaks.
Yes, but the crucial takeaway that ties this all together is this. Even though desire and physical function change over time, overall sexual satisfaction often increases as people get older.
Independent of these physical peaks.
Completely independent, because satisfaction relies so heavily on things like emotional connection, communication, and confidence.
Okay, let's focus now on that central developmental question. The timing of first sexual intercourse, or what the research calls sexual debut.
And the research uses a pretty clear framework to define this timing. Early debut is before age 15.
Normative debut is between 15 and 19.
And late debut is after age 19.
So if we look at the correlations with that early debut before 15, the risks jump out pretty immediately.
They do. And we should be clear, these are correlations, not certainties. But the data links early debut to a much higher risk profile.
So give us the risk synthesis from the sources. What happens when debut occurs that early?
Well, the list is unfortunately pretty long. There's lower consistent use of contraception, a higher likelihood of contracting STIs, and a significantly increased risk of various negative psychological outcomes.
Like what?
We see higher internalizing symptoms. So things like depression and loneliness, and externalizing symptoms like aggression, antisocial behavior, and a very strong link with substance use, smoking, drinking, drugs.
I also saw a consistent finding in the studies about lower educational attainment and decreased relationship quality, sometimes even extending to a higher likelihood of divorce later in life.
That's the core of the theory. That early sexual debut often indicates a trajectory, a pattern of behavior that affects life choices down the line. But here's the key insight we have to talk about: the selection effect.
Okay, unpack that. The selection effect.
Researchers argue that early debut itself might not cause these problems. Rather, it might be a symptom of deeper pre-existing challenges.
Meaning the problems were already there before the sexual activity started.
Exactly. When you track these groups over time, you find that the individuals who have an early debut often face higher levels of family instability, or lacked close parental supervision, or were already exposed to substance use and antisocial peer groups.
So in those cases, the early sexual activity isn't the primary wound. It's more like a reflection of an already challenging life.
It is. And that leads us to this positive shift in research toward what's called a sex-positive framework. Researchers started looking not just at risks, but at the potential rewards, especially for those whose debut was normative or late.
And what did that long-term modeling of those groups reveal?
Something quite surprising. For those whose debut was between 15 and 19, or even later, the event was related to measurable reward.
The rewards? Like what?
They experienced increases in feelings of romantic appeal and sexual satisfaction for both genders. And perhaps counterintuitively, internalizing symptoms like depression and loneliness often declined over time after their debut.
So the mental health markers actually improved?
They did. And substance use grew at a significantly slower rate than it had before. Researchers suggest these positive changes indicate that debut, when it happens at a time of greater emotional maturity, is associated with healthy feelings of desirability, self-confidence, and social maturation.
So it becomes an affirming step, not a problematic one.
Exactly.
So for anyone listening trying to define ready, it clearly isn't just about blowing out 16 candles. What are the non-negotiable pillars of maturity that the sources stress?
Okay, so based on the synthesis, we can define 5 pillars of true readiness. The first, and it's the most foundational, is informed consent and mutual desire. This has to be fully voluntary, enthusiastic, and totally free from any coercion.
Sounds straightforward, but it requires great communication. What's number 2?
Emotional maturity and resilience. This means having the capacity to handle the potential emotional fallout, rejection, peer opinions, heartbreak. If you're totally reliant on a partner for your self-worth, the emotional risk is just too high.
Right. And what about the practical side?
The third is practical knowledge and access. A full, concrete understanding of contraception, STI prevention, and crucially, access to confidential healthcare. The sources actually recommend establishing a relationship with a healthcare provider, independent of parents, sometime between 13 and 15, well before any sexual activity begins.
That's a great point. And the fourth?
The fourth is personal values. You need clarity about how sex aligns with your own beliefs, your spiritual outlook, your long-term goals.
And finally, the fifth pillar, dealing with the interaction itself.
That's relationship context. Sex should ideally happen within a foundation of trust, safety, mutual respect, and clear, continuous communication. Those 5 pillars, not age alone, are the real measure of readiness.
We've lived pretty thoroughly at the start of the sexual lifespan, so let's shift to the other end. Society often treats sexuality in older age, say 60 and above, as this embarrassing taboo.
Right, with a misconception that desire just disappears and people become asexual.
And that stigma is just overwhelmingly contradicted by the data.
Completely. The desire for intimacy, physical pleasure, it just does not disappear. Survey data from places like England shows that 86% of men and 60% of women aged 60 to 69 reported being sexually active.
That's a massive sexually engaged population that we tend to just overlook.
It is. And not only is it active, but there are measurable, documented health benefits to maintaining a positive sexual life later on.
What kinds of rewards are we seeing?
Oh, positive sexual health in later life is linked to so many benefits. Increased longevity, reduced pain sensitivity, improved cardiovascular health, lower levels of depression, and much greater relationship satisfaction.
Of course, the physical realities do change, which brings different challenges than in youth.
Indeed. Libido generally declines. For women, common challenges include vaginal atrophy and painful intercourse. For men, the most common are erectile dysfunction and premature climax.
But medical advances have made these challenges pretty manageable. We have things like hormone replacement therapy for women and various ED treatments for men.
Absolutely. Those treatments can prolong an active and satisfying sex life well into someone's senior years. But these medical solutions run up against some big systemic challenges.
Like what?
Well, we find that older adults often avoid seeking help for these concerns because of intense embarrassment or stigma. And on top of that, the sources noted that primary care providers often lack specific training in aging sexuality, which just perpetuates the silence.
So if people aren't communicating their needs and doctors aren't asking the right questions, that sounds like a recipe for silent health risks.
It leads directly to one of the most surprising and critical facts from the research. There's a steady increase in STIs and STDs being diagnosed in elderly individuals, sometimes even in residential facilities.
Why is that population seeing a spike in STDs?
The primary reason researchers cite is behavioral. Many older men in particular fail to use barrier protection because they assume that since the risk of pregnancy is gone, the need for condoms is also gone.
They just forget about the continued circulation and danger of STIs.
They do. It's a profound public health messaging failure. And compounding all of this is the research gap.
Right.
Yes, policy and clinical evidence are severely lagging for this population. A review of clinical trials for STIs found that a shocking 72.7% of them systematically exclude participants over the age of 50.
So we need immediate inclusion in research to generate the evidence we need for this growing sexually active demographic.
Urgently.
So if we synthesize this entire deep dive across the lifespan, from a legal age of consent through the teenage years and into late life, what is the main takeaway for you?
The main takeaway is that readiness is emphatically a process, not a number. It varies legally by where you live and personally by your own maturity.
And we established that while early sexual debut correlates with higher long-term risks,
Often tied to those selection effects like pre-existing problems. But the research also shows significant psychological rewards happen when debut is aligned with greater emotional maturity.
so ultimately the key to positive sexual outcomes across the entire life spectrum, whether you're 16 or 86, is not the physical age on your birth certificate.
No, it's about informed decision-making, preparedness, and open communication. It's prioritizing holistic maturity over simple physical milestones. The foundation of all good outcomes is preparation.
That leaves us with a provocative thought to wrap up today, one that really connects the legal and the biological findings of this deep dive. If legal consent ages are defined nationally, often set at 16 or 18, and biological readiness is measured individually, how should societies reconcile the legal responsibility of an adolescent with the documented fact that the brain's highest judgment center, the prefrontal cortex, isn't fully mature until the mid-20s? Think about that tension between law and neurobiology until next time.